What's up, fisher people? So the post-spawn bite has started on some lakes in the area, and it's getting close on my home lake here, Lake Sakakawea, North Dakota. And I wanted to go through what you're looking for when you're trying to find walleyes in a spring post-spawn situation. And when it comes to spring post-spawn, it all revolves around water temperature. You're looking for the warmest water you can possibly find. Until you start getting into that mid-upper 60s, close to 70 degrees, they're gonna be looking for the warmest water they can find. Now, what's gonna determine that? Well, the less water there is to heat up, the faster it heats up, right? So you wanna look to see the way the lake sets up to figure out where some of that shallower water is and know that that's probably the water that's gonna warm up the quickest. And where is some of that shallower water? Typically the bays. Everything this time of year usually revolves around the bays, and then eventually they'll start moving out of some bays into some shallower parts of the lake system. But we're gonna probably focus on the bays for the most part today, and we're gonna use Devil's Lake, North Dakota as an example because it's so diverse. It's got so many different little nooks and crannies, and it just illustrates this point extremely well. But if you're looking at a reservoir system like Sakakawea, the same thing kind of holds. You're gonna need to focus in a bay. You're gonna need to find warmer, shallower water. So let's dig into it on the map here with Devil's Lake. Okay, so Devil's Lake specifically, the way it happens to set up, if you look at this east side of the lake, it typically has some steeper shorelines and some deeper waters. You can see that there's just a lot of this cliff-like edges, pretty deep water. Now there's some bays over on the east side of the lake that you could have luck in, maybe back in here, that kind of stuff. But for the most part, if I'm fishing Devil's Lake, I'm kind of staying away from that area. Now you got some bays here as you start to work west, that can be good. You got some bays down in here, that can be good in the spring, that you can see some of the shallower water. But as this lake lays out, the eastern part of the lake tends to be deeper, and as you go further west, it tends to get shallower. So if we start looking at, like, here's main Devil's Lake Bay that we're in right here, this bowl, it starts to get a little better, and you do have some bays that come off of it here that are fishable, especially if you get back here. 6 Mile Bay is this example. But even in the beginning of 6 Mile Bay, you got some fairly steep shoreline stuff. It's not really the ticket until you start to get back in here. Now, when you're looking for these bays, like, I don't necessarily want a bay that's just 1, 2, maybe 3 foot of water. That can work depending on what the lake is. I like to see something that's got a little more depth than that, but if you got 8 or 10 feet, that's plenty of water. I fish a lot of places around this area on Sakakawea where most of the bay that I'm fishing, the channel area, whatever it is, maxes out at 10 feet, and you can find plenty of walleyes in that area, and it warms up really quickly. If we keep looking west here on Devil's Lake, you start to find this West Bay area is definitely shallower than some of the rest of the stuff. And this main lake will eventually get good after they start moving out of the bays. But the point being, the bays on the west side of the lake, which is already shallower, are gonna be even warmer than on the east side of the lake. So you can basically pick any old bay around here. Howard's Bay is a great example. Now, when you look into the middle of Howard Bay here, once you get through from the main lake into the bay, what do we got here? 14 feet max. And you can see all this red area. I think my shallow highlight's 10 and under, which probably doesn't need to be quite that much, but all this red area is pretty good fishable area this time of the year. And you can focus on some of these, like, points, particular shoreline things, that kind of stuff, but you really don't necessarily need to. That might hold a few more higher concentrations of fish, that kind of stuff. But a lot of times, especially if it's a smaller bay and it's all flat, for basically the same depth, they can just roam around in that area, just kind of cruise around looking for things to eat. So a lot of times I'll find that if you just kind of cruise the middle of these bays and just cast and pitch around or use your side scan, you'll start to find fish seemingly anywhere aimlessly in that bay because they're just looking for that warm water. But the one thing that will concentrate them for sure is the wind. So windswept shorelines are a big thing. If you're fishing a bay and you got some wind blowing one direction or another, you want to fish the windswept side because that's where it's moving bait, it's moving action, it's moving the warmer water into that corner. If you got like a lot of wind pushing out of the bay, that bay may not be the one to fish that day. If wind's pushing into the bay, that's a really good thing, especially if it's doing it for 2 or 3 or 4 days in a row. So once you find these shallow water bays and you find that warmer water temperature, say the main lake's 48 degrees, and you get into a bay and you start seeing 55 degrees, and then you get into a corner of the bay and you see 58, 59. That's your ticket right there, and it's probably because the wind's pushing into that spot. So you find the shallow bays, you find the shallower water, and then you find where the wind's pushing things, and that is absolutely money for finding walleyes spring post-spawn. And it doesn't even have to be something super, super obvious. So like as you go up here, closer to Pelican Lake, so here's the bridge right there where you would enter into Pelican from West Bay. And there's just this seemingly little innocuous sort of, almost more of a cove than a bay. It's actually called Don's Bay per the map here. Just something subtle like this. Just this little corner that has shallower water that warms up, especially if you get some wind pushing in from the southeast, that kind of thing. It'll concentrate fish back here and you just fish these shorelines. The fish could be anywhere from, I don't know, sometimes they're in 1 or 2 or 3 feet of water, sometimes they're in 6 to 8 to 10 feet of water. Cold fronts will push them slightly deeper. If it warms up, they'll push way up into the shallows to feed off that warmer water. So just something subtle like that can concentrate a bunch of fish in the back of that thing, especially if there's a little bit of weeds, maybe there's a little bit of timber, whatever it may be. So it doesn't have to be anything like very, very obvious as a bay to make it a decent spot. And if you kind of look at the way that this Pelican Lake lays out, so this is kind of the middle of Pelican Lake right here, and it's got all this backwater stuff that feeds off of it. And now that the water is getting higher again, you got some opportunities to come back into this stuff. So like, especially early on in that bite, you can come way back and stuff like this, real shallow water. So what do we got here for a max? Some of that's 17 feet, some of it's 13 here. But sometimes you can find some of these backwater sloughs and stuff if you can get to them. That can be real, real good. Real early. So you can see that Devil's Lake is so diverse with all these little connected lakes that have kind of flooded together. And it's got all these like backwater areas and stuff like that. And you're basically just like, the earliest pre-spawn bite is gonna be in those smaller, flatter, shallower little areas, and the fish just kind of work, or at least the timeline kind of works its way out back towards the main lake. So like I said, as things go, eventually that whole West Bay Lake will reach, 60 to 65 degrees, and the fish might come out of the bays and go into the lake. And then eventually that middle basin starts to get a little better, and then East Lake starts to get a little better, but it takes time. And that's another reason why, like Lake Sakakawea, for example, as deep and as much water as there is there, usually turns on a little later than some of the smaller lakes in the nearby area. It's all about water temperature. Let's go to another little bay here on the West Lake of Devils. This little thing called Holly Bay, so you can get into here. You gotta be a little careful getting through trees. If everybody's ever been to Devil Lake, it's a lot of tree stuff. But if you're gonna get into one of these spots here, first of all, you see the bay does max out at 25 feet, so you're gonna wanna come a little further back typically to where it starts to get a little shallower. But a lot of times you can find fish all the way in the very extreme backs of these things, maybe all the way back in here. So if I'm getting to these bays and it's reachable, sometimes the first thing I do is go all the way to the very back of the bay and work my way out. That's where I'm gonna find the warmest water, especially if the wind's blowing back there. And you'd be surprised the fish that you can catch this time of year in super far back bay spots that you might think only carp sit, but there's gonna be walleyes back there. And again, could you target a specific spot? Absolutely you can. So like looking here, you got a couple of points in this little neck down area, so you can fish those 2 points. They might concentrate some more fish. This little inside turn might concentrate some more fish. But a lot of times you might just find fish just kind of roaming this general area. But I always start with pitching the shorelines before I'm pitching out in the middle of the bay. Pitch a shoreline, pitch a point, pitch a weed line, whatever it is, and just kind of cruise with your boat, keep your side scan on. If it's a sandy bottom, those fish are gonna pop out really good. If there's like some grassy, mossy bottom, the fish might sit down in it. Might be a little harder to see them, so you might have to just fish for the fish. But side imaging is deadly, this time of year to find fish away from the boat if it's sandy enough and if they can pop on the screen. But cruise around that area, pick a bay that's got the right water temp, the warmest you can find, and start covering water and see what you find. The fish will tell you if they're there typically. You start catching them on those jigs, minnows, plastics, whatever it is. But again, look at the way the lake lays out, figure out what part of the lake is some shallower water that's gonna warm up quicker, and then once you get in that area, keep narrowing it down to find warmer and warmer water yet, and then maybe specific little points, shoreline nooks, weed lines, whatever it is on that area, and you're gonna be successful. That's how you find fish this time of year. So if this has been helpful for you, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button to say so. Maybe think about subscribing to the channel, maybe even think about becoming a Patreon member and contributing further, and later, fisher people.